Yorkshire, January, 1818. The ledger pages felt cold beneath Imogen Fairchild's trembling fingers as she stood in the shadowed study of Mortimer House, the dying afternoon light barely penetrating the heavy velvet curtains. She had come seeking reassurance, perhaps foolishly hoping to find evidence of the honorable man she had agreed to marry. Instead, the neat columns of numbers before her told a story of calculated cruelty that made her stomach turn. £20,000. Stolen from widows, orphans, and the most vulnerable members of society whose trust had been placed in the Mortimer family's hands as estate managers and trustees. Her intended husband, Lord Nigel Mortimer, had systematically embezzled funds meant to provide for those who had no one else to protect them. The sound of boots on marble in the corridor outside sent ice through her veins. She had perhaps 30 seconds before discovery, 30 seconds to decide whether to pretend ignorance or confront the man who held her family's fate in his hands. Her mother lay bedridden at home. Her younger sister, Penelope, needed a respectable dowry, and their creditors grew more insistent by the day. Nigel Mortimer had seemed like salvation when he proposed 3 months ago. If stories of betrayal, courage, and unexpected salvation move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The door swung open with deliberate slowness. Nigel Mortimer entered his private study with the confident stride of a man who believed himself untouchable, his handsome face arranged in its customary expression of practiced charm. He was 30 years old, the younger son of Viscount Mortimer, and had cultivated a reputation as a shrewd businessman and eligible bachelor. That reputation, Imogen now understood, was built on stolen money and calculated deception. "My dear Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice carrying that pleasant warmth that had once reassured her. "What an unexpected pleasure. I did not realize you planned to visit this afternoon." Imogen straightened her spine, feeling the weight of her shabby morning dress, now 2 years old and carefully mended in places that she hoped did not show. At 23, she had learned to carry herself with dignity despite the genteel poverty that had claimed her family after her father's death. That dignity served her now as she met Nigel's gaze directly. "I needed to speak with you regarding our wedding arrangements," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your study door was ajar, and I confess curiosity led me to examine the books on your desk while I waited." Something flickered behind Nigel's pale blue eyes, quick as a serpent's tongue. His gaze moved to the open ledger, then back to her face. The pleasant expression never wavered, but Imogen felt the air in the room change, become charged with a danger she had been too naive to recognize before. "How very thorough of you," he said softly, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that seemed unnaturally loud. "And what, pray tell, did you discover in your examination?" "Enough to know that the man I agreed to marry is a thief and a liar." The words hung between them like a drawn blade. Imogen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she refused to look away, refused to show the fear that clawed at her throat. She had spent 23 years learning to be small, to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness society might throw to the impoverished daughter of a disgraced baron. But standing in this study, surrounded by evidence of cruelty that affected women and children even more desperate than herself, something inside her had crystallized into steel. Nigel moved closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne and something else beneath it, something cold. "Such harsh words from my gentle bride," he murmured. "Perhaps you misunderstood the complexities of estate management. These matters can appear irregular to the uninformed eye. I am quite capable of understanding embezzlement when I see it documented so thoroughly," Imogen replied. Her father had taught her mathematics and bookkeeping, considering such skills practical for a daughter unlikely to inherit. That education, meant to help her manage whatever modest household she might achieve, now allowed her to see through Nigel's theft with perfect clarity. The Grayson Widows' settlement, reduced by 40%, the Haverstoke Orphans' Trust, depleted to cover what appeared to be gambling debts. the Wickham estate accounts, showing payments to creditors that I strongly suspect are fictional. You have been remarkably industrious. I have been remarkably foolish, Imogen countered, taking a step backward as he approached. But I am correcting that error now. I cannot marry a man who profits from the suffering of those he is honor-bound to protect. Nigel's expression finally shifted, the pleasant mask sliding away to reveal something harder beneath. "Cannot?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "My dear Miss Fairchild, I am afraid you do not fully comprehend your situation. Your family owes my father £20,000. Your mother requires constant medical care. Your sister requires a dowry if she is to have any hope of avoiding the fate of becoming a governess or companion. Without my patronage, your family faces complete ruin. Better ruin than complicity and theft. How very noble." Nigel's smile held no warmth. "And how very foolish. Do you truly believe anyone would credit the accusations of an impoverished spinster against the word of a viscount's son? My family has connections throughout Yorkshire and beyond. Your father's name carries only the stain of his failed investments and the debts he left behind." The truth of his words struck like a physical blow, but Imogen held her ground. "Nevertheless, I will not marry you. I will return your ring, and we will consider our engagement terminated." "I am afraid that will not be possible." Something in his tone made her blood run cold. She moved toward the door, but Nigel was faster, positioning himself between her and escape. When he spoke again, his voice carried a terrible reasonableness that was somehow more frightening than open threat. "You have placed me in a difficult position, Miss Fairchild. I am expected to marry within the year to satisfy my maiden aunt's requirements for releasing my inheritance. You are expected to marry me to save your family from debtor's prison. These are arrangements that benefit us both. Your newly discovered moral sensibilities, while touching, are inconvenient." "Step aside," Imogen said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "I am leaving." "Not quite yet, I think." Nigel's hand closed around her wrist, not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to communicate his control. "We need to reach an understanding, you and I. You will continue with our engagement plans. You will smile appropriately at our wedding in 6 weeks, and you will never speak of what you believe you discovered in those ledgers. Release me at once." "Or what, precisely?" His grip tightened fractionally. "You will expose me? With what evidence? I can remove these ledgers tonight, replace them with perfectly innocuous documents. It will be your word against mine, and forgive me for noting that your word carries rather little weight in society." Imogen wrenched her arm free with a sudden twist that her father had taught her years ago when explaining how a lady might defend herself against unwanted advances. Nigel stumbled backward, more from surprise than force, and she seized the opportunity to pull the door open. "If you attempt to leave this house," he called after her, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I will call in your father's debts immediately. Your mother will be turned from your home by week's end." She paused in the doorway, her breath coming hard, torn between the desperate need to flee and the equally desperate knowledge that he could destroy her family with a word. When she turned back, Nigel had composed himself, straightening his cravat with deliberate care. "However," he continued, his tone smoothing back toward pleasantness like oil over water, "if you are amenable to reason, perhaps we might discuss this matter further. I propose a compromise. Tomorrow, we take a sleigh ride through the countryside, just the two of us. It will give us opportunity to discuss our future privately, away from potential interruptions. We can reach an understanding that satisfies us both." Every instinct Imogen possessed screamed that accepting this invitation was dangerous, yet what choice remained? If she refused and fled, her family would suffer. If she went to the authorities with her accusations, they would dismiss her as Nigel predicted. She needed time, needed to think, needed to find some way out of this trap that her own desperate circumstances had led her into. "Very well," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow morning, Excellent. I shall collect you at 10 o'clock. We shall have a lovely ride through the forest paths. The snow has been quite beautiful this week." The casual way he spoke of snow and beauty, while the threat of ruin hung between them, made Imogen's skin crawl. She left Mortimer House without another word, walking the 2 miles back to the modest cottage that was all her family retained of their former wealth. The January wind bit through her inadequate cloak, but she barely noticed, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended in disaster. That evening, as she helped her mother with supper and listened to Penelope's cheerful chatter about a book she was reading, Imogen made a decision. Tomorrow, during this sleigh ride, she would make one final attempt to appeal to whatever conscience Nigel Mortimer might possess. She would offer to keep silent about his theft in exchange for releasing her from their engagement and extending the terms of her family's debt. It was a compromise that tasted like poison, but it might be the only path that allowed her family to survive. She did not sleep that night, watching the moon track across her bedroom ceiling, while trying not to think about the fact that she was about to bargain with a man who had proven himself utterly without honor. Morning came gray and bitter. Imogen dressed carefully in her warmest gown, a dark green wool that had once belonged to her mother and had been altered to fit her smaller frame. She wound a thick scarf around her neck and pulled on the fur-lined gloves that were among the last remnants of her family's better days. When Nigel's sleigh arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, she kissed her mother's cheek and told her she would return by midday. Nigel handed her into the sleigh with perfect courtesy, tucking a heavy blanket around her lap. His groom stood ready at the horses' heads, and for a moment, Imogen felt a surge of relief at not being entirely alone. That relief died when Nigel dismissed the man with a casual wave. "We shall not require you, Briggs. I am quite capable of managing the horses myself." "Sir, the mistress said I was to accompany you on all outings," the groom protested, his weathered face uncertain. "And I am telling you that your services are not needed. Take the afternoon for yourself." The groom's gaze flickered to Imogen, something like concern in his eyes, but he could not refuse a direct order from his employer's son. He stepped back reluctantly, and Nigel set the horses in motion with a skill that suggested he truly did know how to handle them. They drove in silence through the village and out onto the country roads that wound through the Yorkshire forests. The snow lay thick and pristine on either side, beautiful in the weak winter sunlight. Under other circumstances, Imogen might have found the scene peaceful. Instead, her apprehension grew with each passing mile as they moved farther from any possibility of help. "You are very quiet, my dear," Nigel observed, his eyes on the road ahead. "Nervous about our discussion?" "Cautious," Imogen corrected. "Mr. Mortimer, I have a proposal." "How delightful. I am listening." "I will keep silent about what I discovered in your ledgers. I will never speak a word of it to anyone, upon my honor. In exchange, you will release me from our engagement and extend the terms of my family's debt by 5 years. Surely you can find another bride to satisfy your aunt's requirements, one who has not become inconveniently knowledgeable about your business practices." Nigel was quiet for a long moment, his gloved hands steady on the reins. They had entered a section of deep forest now, where the trees grew thick on either side and the road narrowed to little more than a track. The only sound was the soft shush of the runners over snow and the occasional jingle of harness. "An interesting proposition," he said finally. "It demonstrates a certain practical thinking that I confess I had not credited you with. However, I am afraid I must decline." "But surely you see the benefit," Imogen began. "You see, Miss Fairchild, you have already demonstrated that you possess both the intelligence to understand my business affairs and the convenient conscience to consider keeping silent about them for the right price. That makes you, I am sorry to say, a loose end I cannot afford." The horses had slowed to a walk. Nigel pulled them to a complete stop near a steep embankment where the forest floor dropped away sharply into a rocky ravine. The isolation was suddenly, terribly apparent. The nearest house was miles behind them, and the road ahead showed no tracks to suggest recent travelers. "What do you mean?" Imogen asked, though she was beginning to understand with a clarity that turned her mouth dry. "I mean that I cannot trust you to keep silent, not truly. Today you agree to secrecy for the price of your family's security. Tomorrow, your conscience might trouble you. Next month, you might decide that justice matters more than safety. Or perhaps, should you ever discover additional evidence, you might choose to revisit our arrangement and demand more favorable terms. I would never do such a thing. You cannot promise that with certainty, and neither can I rely upon it." Nigel turned to face her fully, and what she saw in his expression made her blood ice over. There was regret there, or a performance of regret, but beneath it was something cold and final. "I am truly sorry, Miss Fairchild. You seem a decent enough young woman, and under different circumstances, I might have even enjoyed being married to you. But you have become a burden that requires a permanent solution." Imogen lunged for the side of the sleigh away from the drop, but Nigel was prepared. His hand shot out, catching her shoulder and shoving with brutal force toward the embankment. She tumbled over the edge of the sleigh, scrabbling for purchase on the icy road, but he struck her hard across the face, the blow sending her reeling backward. She fell. The world spun in a confusion of white and gray as she tumbled down the steep, snow-covered slope. Her body struck rocks and roots, the air driven from her lungs, until finally, her head collided with something hard and unyielding at the bottom of the ravine. Pain exploded through her skull, bright and stunning, and she felt warmth spreading through her hair even as the cold of the snow pressed against her face. She lay perfectly still, half buried in a drift, unable to draw breath to scream. High above, she heard Nigel's voice, distant and muffled by the wind. "A tragic accident," he called down, his voice carrying no trace of the charm he wore so well in drawing rooms. "The horses startled and you were thrown. I shall be devastated naturally. And since the ravine is so steep, I am afraid it would be quite impossible for me to climb down and check for signs of life without risking my own safety. Goodbye, Miss Fairchild." She tried to move, tried to speak, but her body would not respond. The pain in her head was fading to a dull roar, which she understood dimly was not a good sign. She heard the sleigh moving away, the sound of runners on snow growing fainter, until there was only silence and cold and the gentle whisper of snowflakes beginning to fall from the gray sky above. "This is how I die," she thought with strange clarity. "Alone in the snow because I tried to do the right thing." Time lost meaning. She might have lain there for minutes or hours, consciousness ebbing and flowing like a tide. The snow continued to fall, gentle and persistent, slowly covering her still form. She thought of her mother and Penelope, wondered who would care for them now, hoped they would forgive her for failing them so completely. Then, from somewhere beyond the edges of her fading awareness, came the sound of hoofbeats. The rhythm of a horse moving at steady pace through snow penetrated the fog that wrapped her thoughts. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, lost in the soft fall of snow. The hoofbeats came closer, then stopped on the road above. She heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted, then boots crunching through snow, sliding and scrambling down the steep embankment. Good God! The curse, bitten off in a voice she did not recognize, was followed by the sensation of gloved hands touching her neck, her wrist, gentle despite their obvious urgency. The hands found the wound on her head, and she heard a sharp intake of breath. "Can you hear me?" the voice demanded. It was a man's voice, deep and carrying an accent that marked him as educated and wealthy. "If you can understand, try to respond." Imogen's eyes fluttered open with tremendous effort. The face above her was unfamiliar, harsh planes and angles framed by dark hair silvered at the temples, despite his relative youth. His eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and intense, fixed on her with an expression of fierce concentration. Mortimer, she managed, the name scraping past frozen lips. Mortimer did this. Those storm-gray eyes narrowed, and for a moment Imogen saw something in them that was not pity, but a recognition of shared fury. He saw her defiance, even as she lay broken. Nigel Mortimer? She could not manage more words, but she must have communicated something through her expression because the stranger's mouth compressed into a grim line. He shrugged out of his greatcoat with swift efficiency, wrapping it around her carefully before lifting her into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. "You are going to live," he stated, his tone making it sound like an order rather than a hope. "I will not permit anything else." The ride that followed existed in fragments. The warmth of his body pressed against hers, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, the bite of wind that he shielded her from with his own frame. Once, she surfaced enough to see that they had reached a building, lights glowing golden in windows, voices calling out in alarm. "Send for Dr. Harrison immediately," she heard him command. "Tell him Lord Winters requires his attendance at the Boar and Stag. A woman, head wound, possible exposure. He is to come now and send the bill to Lockhart Manor." Lord Winters. The name pulled at threads of memory. She had heard of the Marquess of Lockhart, everyone in Yorkshire had. He was known as the Ice Marquess, a man of immense wealth and power who had spent the decades since inheriting his title building an empire of influence while maintaining a reputation for cold ruthlessness. He never married, rarely appeared in society, and was said to be pursuing some private vendetta against an unnamed enemy with patient determination. Why would such a man be riding through a forest in a snowstorm? Why would he stop to help a stranger bleeding in the snow? Consciousness slipped away again before she could form the questions, let alone seek answers. She woke to find herself in a bed with clean sheets that smelled of lavender, a fire crackling in a well-maintained grate nearby. Her head throbbed with vicious intensity, but when she reached up cautiously, she found it bandaged with professional care. The room around her was simple but comfortable, the furnishings of a respectable country inn. A woman sat in a chair near the fire, her gray hair neatly pinned and her dress marking her as a respectable matron. She looked up from her needlework as Imogen stirred, her lined face creasing in relief. "Awake at last, thank the Lord. You gave us quite a fright, miss. Do not try to sit up too quickly. Dr. Harrison said you would be dizzy." "Where am I?" Imogen's voice came out as a croak. "The Boar and Stag, just outside Marston Village. His lordship brought you here 2 days ago, half frozen and bleeding something terrible. The physician said it was a miracle you survived at all, and we owe it entirely to Lord Winters finding you when he did." 2 days. Imogen's heart seized with sudden panic. "My family, they must be frantic. I must send word." "It has been attended to, miss. His lordship dispatched a messenger to your mother immediately." "He told her I am here?" Imogen asked, panic rising. "If Nigel learns I am alive—" "No, miss. His lordship was most specific," the woman assured her, leaning closer. "The messenger carried a letter warning your mother that you were injured but safe, and that for your protection, she must tell absolutely no one, especially not Lord Mortimer. The messenger was instructed to bring your family here under guard this very afternoon. They should be arriving within the hour." "Why?" The question escaped before Imogen could stop it. Why would a Marquess concern himself with a stranger? The woman's expression grew carefully neutral. "That would be a question for his lordship himself, miss. He asked to be informed the moment you woke. Shall I send word?" Imogen wanted to refuse, wanted time to gather her scattered thoughts and make sense of events, but she knew that was cowardice. Whatever Lord Winter's reasons for helping her, she owed him her life. The least she could do was thank him properly and attempt to explain the circumstances that had led to her being abandoned in the snow. "Yes," she said quietly. "Please send word." The woman left, and Imogen used the time alone to attempt to impose order on her tumultuous thoughts. Nigel Mortimer had tried to murder her. That fact was undeniable. He had pushed her into the ravine, watched her fall, and left her to die. By now, he must believe himself successful, must think her body lay frozen and undiscovered somewhere in that forest. What would he do when he learned she lived? Would he try again? And what of her family? The debt remained, the threat to her mother and sister unchanged. She had escaped death only to find herself trapped by the same impossible circumstances that had led her into Nigel's snare in the first place. The door opened with a soft click. Lord Jasper Winters, Marquess of Lockhart, entered the room with the controlled grace of a man accustomed to authority. In the firelight, his face appeared even more severe than she remembered from her brief moments of consciousness in the snow. He was perhaps 36 or 37, tall and lean with the build of a man who spent time in physical pursuits. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his gray eyes held an intensity that made her want to look away, even as something about his presence commanded attention. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice that same deep timbre she remembered. "I am relieved to see you awake and coherent. Dr. Harrison was uncertain whether the head injury might have caused lasting damage." "Lord Winters." She struggled to sit up further, and he moved forward with surprising speed, adjusting the pillows behind her back with impersonal efficiency. "I owe you my life. I do not know how to adequately express my gratitude. Gratitude can be addressed later. First, I require answers." He pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat with the directness of a man unconcerned with social niceties. "You said Mortimer's name as I found you. Nigel Mortimer. Did he do this to you?" The blunt question caught her off guard, but perhaps directness was better than dancing around the truth. "Yes." "Why?" Imogen drew a careful breath, trying to order her thoughts despite the pounding in her skull. "I discovered evidence of his embezzlement. He had been systematically stealing from the widows and orphans under his family's trust management. When I confronted him and attempted to break our engagement, he suggested we take a sleigh ride to discuss matters. Instead, he pushed me into a ravine and left me to die." Lord Winters' expression did not change, but something flickered in those gray eyes, quick and cold as lightning in a winter storm. "You were engaged to Nigel Mortimer?" "Yes. My family is in desperate circumstances. He offered financial relief in exchange for marriage, and I was foolish enough to believe him an honorable man." The shame of that naivety burned, but she forced herself to continue. "I did not discover his true nature until it was nearly too late. This evidence of embezzlement," Lord Winters said, leaning forward slightly. "How detailed was it?" "Extremely detailed. Ledgers showing every transaction, every theft, going back at least 5 years. £20,000 stolen from those who had no one to protect them. Could you reconstruct what you saw? Specific names, amounts, dates?" The question surprised her. "I believe so, at least partially. I have always had a facility for numbers and record-keeping. Why do you ask?" Lord Winters rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape with his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice carried a controlled intensity that raised the hairs on Imogen's arms. 20 years ago, my elder brother Edmund inherited the title of Marquess of Lockhart when our father died. Edmund was everything a nobleman should be: kind, honorable, devoted to duty. He also served as trustee for several estates in Yorkshire, including one managed by the Mortimer family. He paused, his shoulders rigid beneath his perfectly tailored coat. 10 years ago, Edmund came to me with concerns about irregularities in the Mortimer accounts. He had discovered what he believed was evidence of fraud. Before he could present his findings to the authorities, he died in what was ruled an accident. A fall from his horse on a clear day on familiar ground. His horse, which had never been known to startle, allegedly shied at nothing and threw him. Imogen's breath caught. "You believe it was murder?" "I know it was murder." Lord Winters turned back to face her, and the cold fury in his expression was terrible to behold. I have spent the last decade attempting to prove the Mortimers responsible, but they are clever and well-connected. Every investigation leads nowhere. Every witness conveniently forgets crucial details or disappears entirely. I have built my fortune and influence for one purpose: to destroy the family that murdered my brother and continues to profit from their crimes. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Imogen understood now why he had asked about her ability to recall the ledgers, why he had brought her here rather than simply sending her home. She possessed something he needed, knowledge that could finally give him the weapon he had sought for 10 years. "You want me to help you," she said slowly. "Yes." "In exchange for what? My life, which you have already saved? Protection from Nigel when he learns I survived?" "Those, certainly. But I am offering more than that, Miss Fairchild." He moved back to the chair, sitting down and fixing her with that intense gray gaze. "I am offering you a position that would place you entirely beyond the Mortimers' reach. A position that would provide security for your family and the means to ensure Nigel Mortimer and his entire corrupt family face justice. What position could possibly accomplish all of that?" "My wife." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment Imogen was certain she had misheard. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of jest or madness, but Lord Winters looked back at her with perfect seriousness. "You cannot be in earnest," she managed. "I am entirely in earnest. Consider the practicalities, Miss Fairchild. As my wife, you would be the Marchioness of Lockhart, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Yorkshire. Your family's debts would be settled immediately, your mother and sister provided for beyond any possibility of want. More importantly, you would be completely untouchable by the Mortimers. They would not dare attempt to harm you again, not when you were under my protection and carried my name." "But marriage is—" Imogen struggled to articulate the enormity of what he proposed. "It is meant to be for love, for companionship, for building a life together. For people of our class, marriage is a practical arrangement far more often than it is a love match," Lord Winters countered. "I have no interest in love, Miss Fairchild. I watched what love did to my brother when he lost his wife in childbirth years before his own death. Love makes one vulnerable, and vulnerability leads to destruction. What I am proposing is a business transaction. I require a witness who cannot be silenced. As my wife, you are that witness. You speak of me as if I am a weapon. Because against the Mortimers, that is precisely what you are, and I intend to wield you to destroy them." His voice was devoid of softness, yet there was an honesty in it that she appreciated. "You gain freedom from fear, security for your family, and the satisfaction of knowing you helped bring murderers and thieves to justice. Those you helped me convict cannot only be the Mortimers. Every widow they robbed, every orphan they left destitute will find restitution. Your moral outrage at discovering Nigel's crimes suggests you care about such things." He was right, damn him. Imogen did care, cared desperately about the injustice she had witnessed in those ledgers. But marriage? Marriage to a man she did not know, a man who admitted openly that he felt nothing beyond cold calculation? "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Time is a luxury you may not have," Lord Winters replied. "By now, Nigel Mortimer believes you dead. When he learns otherwise, and he will learn, he will come for you again. You know too much, and he has already proven himself willing to commit murder. Your family will be his leverage, Miss Fairchild. He will threaten your mother and sister to ensure your silence or your cooperation, and you will have no legal protection to offer them. As your wife, I would have that protection. As my wife, you would have my entire fortune and influence at your disposal. The Mortimers are powerful, but they are not powerful enough to threaten a Marchioness, particularly not when I am actively seeking their destruction. Moreover, the investigation into their affairs will have royal sanction. I have cultivated connections at court for precisely this purpose." Imogen's mind raced through the implications. Everything he said was logically sound, yet the thought of binding herself to this cold, calculating stranger for the rest of her life made her throat tight with something very like panic. "What would you expect from this marriage?" she asked carefully. "You speak of it as a business arrangement, but marriage has certain expectations. I require your cooperation in building the case against the Mortimers. Your memory of those ledgers, your willingness to testify if necessary, and your public presence as my wife to prevent Nigel from making another attempt on your life. Beyond that, you would have considerable freedom. I maintain several properties where you could reside if you found my company unpleasant, though I would request your presence at certain social functions where appearances matter." "And children? Heirs?" Something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that suggested she had touched on a sensitive subject. "That would be your decision entirely. I have cousins who could inherit if necessary. I would not force attentions upon you that you found unwelcome." The careful way he phrased it made Imogen realize that he was offering her what amounted to a marriage in name only, a social arrangement that would protect and provide for her without requiring emotional or physical intimacy. It should have been reassuring, yet somehow it felt like a different sort of trap, one lined with cold practicality instead of false affection. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "Until tomorrow morning. I have men watching the roads, but we cannot remain at this inn indefinitely. I can have you return to your family, though I cannot guarantee your safety once you leave my protection. Or I can arrange for a special license and we can be married by week's end." "A week? To prepare for marriage?" "The circumstances are unusual," Lord Winters acknowledged. "But every hour we delay is another hour the Mortimers have to discover you survived. I would prefer to present them with a fait accompli they cannot undo." He rose from the chair, preparing to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at her. "I am not a good man, Miss Fairchild. I am ruthless and calculating, and I have dedicated a decade to vengeance. But I am a man of my word, and I swear to you that if you agree to this arrangement, I will protect you and yours with everything I possess. The Mortimers will face justice. Your family will be secure, and you will be safe." Then he was gone, leaving Imogen alone with the fire's crackle and the weight of an impossible decision. She lay awake through the night, her head aching and her thoughts circling endlessly. Every path seemed to lead to disaster. If she refused Lord Winters and returned home, Nigel would eventually learn of her survival. Even if she fled Yorkshire entirely, her family would remain vulnerable. The debts would still exist, the threats would still be real, and she would have no way to protect her mother and sister from the consequences of her defiance. But marriage to Lord Winters? Marriage to a man who spoke of vengeance and calculation with the same cold precision? By dawn, she had reached her decision. When Lord Winters arrived that morning, she was sitting up in bed with her breakfast tray pushed aside, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. He looked at her face and seemed to understand immediately that she had made her choice. "Miss Fairchild?" "I have conditions," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Name them." "First, I want assurance that my family will be safe immediately. They arrived an hour ago and are being settled in a private wing of the inn. We will all travel to Lockhart Manor today. Second, I want your word that the prosecution of the Mortimers will focus not only on your brother's death, but on restitution for all their victims. The widows and orphans who were robbed deserve justice as much as you do." "You have it. I intend to pursue full restitution as part of any criminal proceedings. Third, I want the right to maintain correspondence and visits with my family without restriction. Of course, I am not a jailer, Miss Fairchild." She drew a deep breath, steadying herself for the final leap. "Then yes, Lord Winters, I will marry you." He inclined his head in The special license will be obtained today. We can be married in 3 days at Lockhart Manor's private chapel." 3 days, she repeated, the reality of it settling over her like a heavy cloak. He turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Fairchild, you are making the right choice. I know it does not feel that way at present, but I assure you that 3 years from now, when the Mortimers have been brought to justice and your family is secure, you will not regret this decision." 3 years? The time frame startled her. "That is my estimate for how long it will take to build an undeniable proof, pursue it through the courts, and see it to conclusion. I have been patient for 10 years. I can be patient for 3 more if it means certainty of success." After he left, Imogen lay back against the pillows. In 3 days, she would become the Marchioness of Lockhart. She resolved to lock away her dreams of love and focus on the task at hand. She would be a Marchioness, and she would be a survivor. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Lord Winters proved terrifyingly efficient when he chose to be. Her family was transported to Lockhart Manor under heavy guard, her mother pale with worry but visibly relieved to find Imogen alive. Penelope, at 16, seemed torn between horror at what had happened and excitement at the prospect of her sister marrying a Marquess. The conversation with her mother was difficult but necessary. Lord Winters had been true to his word, explaining the circumstances with brutal honesty in Imogen's presence. "Are you certain?" her mother asked privately after Lord Winters had left them alone. "Marriage is forever, my dear. I do not want you to feel forced into this because of our debts." "I am certain," Imogen replied. "Lord Winters has been honest about what he expects and what he offers. And Mama, he saved my life. He could have left me in that snow, but he stopped. He helped. That speaks to some measure of honor, does it not?" On the morning of her wedding day, Imogen stood before a mirror in one of Lockhart Manor's guest chambers. The dress had been hastily procured from York, a simple but elegant creation in cream silk. Her hair, still healing from the head wound hidden beneath careful arrangement, was styled in the current fashion with small white roses. A knock at the door announced her mother's entrance. "It is time, darling." Lockhart Manor's chapel was small but beautiful. Lord Winters waited at the altar in perfectly tailored dark coat and breeches, his expression as unreadable as ever. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. Imogen spoke her vows in a clear voice that did not tremble, watched Lord Winters slide a heavy gold ring onto her finger, and listened to the vicar pronounce them man and wife. When it came time for the traditional kiss, Lord Winters leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead instead, a gesture that was almost brotherly in its chasteness. Then it was done. She was a Marchioness, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in England. The wedding breakfast that followed was a subdued affair. After her family departed that evening, headed back to their cottage with a purse heavy enough to settle all their debts and provide comfortable living for years to come, Imogen found herself alone with her husband in the Manor's drawing room. The silence stretched between them. "You must be exhausted," Lord Winters said finally. "Mrs. Fletcher has prepared the Marchioness's chambers for you. They adjoin my own rooms, but the connecting door locks from your side. You need not fear intrusion." "Thank you." She hesitated. "And what happens now?" "Now we begin the work of building our case against the Mortimers. But first, you heal properly from your injury and adjust to your new circumstances. I have engaged a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Sutherland to serve as your companion and tutor. She will help you learn what you need to know about managing a household of this size. You have thought of everything." "I always do." He moved to pour himself a drink. "Lady Lockhart, I want you to understand something. I know this marriage is not what you would have chosen, but I will endeavor to make it as tolerable as possible. What I cannot offer you is affection or companionship in the traditional sense. I am not capable of that." "Because you do not believe in love?" she asked. "Because I have seen what happens when one allows oneself to become vulnerable through attachment. My brother loved his wife deeply. When she died, it broke something in him that never healed. Then I lost him as well. I will not permit that vulnerability again. Keeping my emotions contained is not cruelty, Lady Lockhart. It is survival. I understand, she said quietly. I will not expect what you cannot give. Good. He drained his glass. Then I bid you good night. He left the room, leaving Imogen alone with the growing realization that she had bound herself to a man who was determined to remain forever distant. The next week settled into a pattern. Mrs. Adelaide Sutherland proved to be a sensible woman who tutored Imogen in everything from household accounts to the proper way to address nobility. The work gave Imogen a sense of purpose. Lord Winters maintained his distance, though they took dinner together most evenings. He proved to be well-read and intelligent, but never discussed anything personal. 3 weeks after their marriage, he summoned her to his study with a request to begin the serious work of reconstructing the Mortimer ledgers. I have obtained blank ledgers of the type the Mortimers use, he explained. I need you to recreate as much as you can remember of what you saw. Names, amounts, dates, patterns of theft. Imogen settled into the chair and picked up a pen. It was harder than she expected. The numbers did not flow easily. They had to be dragged from her memory through the fog of her recent injury. Her head throbbed with a vicious rhythm as she focused, recalling the names of the victims. The Grayson widow, she murmured, pressing fingers to her temple as dizziness washed over her. She was meant to receive £50 a quarter. The ledger showed payments of only 30. Take your time, Jasper said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He poured a glass of water and placed it near her hand. We need accuracy, not speed. Over the next 2 hours, she filled pages with details of the Mortimers' theft, forcing herself past the pain in her head. The Haverstoke Orphans Trust, she said, writing the name down. Depleted to cover gambling debts. I remember the name Haverstoke appearing repeatedly alongside withdrawals for miscellaneous expenses. This is remarkable, Jasper said, reading over her shoulder. You recall the specific victims? I recall the cruelty, she replied, rubbing her aching eyes. I recall the patterns of how they hid it. It is burned into my mind. With these details, I can begin cross-referencing against estate records and court documents. If we can find even a few of these cases and match them to actual victims, we will have the foundation for criminal charges. And your brother? I am still gathering evidence. But with your testimony establishing their character and methods, the magistrate will be far more inclined to listen to my suspicions regarding Edmund's death. When will we make our case public? She asked. Not yet. First, we gather evidence until we have undeniable proof. Then, we begin planting doubts in society about the Mortimers' financial practices. That sounds like it could take months. At least. Are you prepared for this to be a long campaign? I am prepared, Imogen said, and found that she meant it. I want justice. Something shifted in Lord Winter's expression, a slight easing of the rigid control he maintained. You surprise me, Lady Lockhart. I expected you to be frightened of confronting them again. I am frightened, she admitted, but I am also angry. Indeed. He gathered the papers. These will be locked in my private safe. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Imogen spent her mornings learning her duties and her afternoons working with Lord Winters. They fell into an easy working relationship that felt almost like partnership. Then, 6 weeks after their marriage, came the invitation that would change everything. Lady Beatrice Sutherland, a prominent figure in Yorkshire society and one of Lord Winter's distant cousins, was hosting a house party. It is unavoidable, Lord Winters said. We must attend, and we must present ourselves as a united couple. Society will be watching. Will the Mortimers be there? Imogen asked. Almost certainly, but that is why we must attend. We need to let the Mortimers see that you are alive, that you are beyond their reach, and that you are backed by power they cannot challenge. The house party was to last a full week. As their carriage rolled up the drive of Lady Beatrice's magnificent estate, Imogen smoothed the skirt of her deep emerald silk gown. "Breathe," Lord Winters murmured. "You look every inch a marchioness. Remember that you have as much right to be here as anyone else." She clung to those words as they entered the house. Lady Beatrice greeted them warmly, though her eyes were shrewd. "My dear Jasper, what a delight! And this must be the new Marchioness of Lockhart. Such a whirlwind courtship! You must tell me all about how you captured our famously elusive Marquess's heart." "I am afraid the capture was entirely the other way around, cousin," Lord Winters intervened smoothly. "One look at Lady Lockhart, and I knew I had found the woman I had been waiting for all these years." He delivered the lie with such conviction that Imogen almost believed it herself. "There will be dinner this evening," he told her later in their suite. 40 guests, including the Mortimers. Nigel will probe for weaknesses. You must appear completely unaffected by his presence." "I can manage it," Imogen said, channeling every lesson in dignity she had learned. "Good. You need not face him alone. I will be at your side throughout." Dinner was an elaborate affair. Imogen found Nigel Mortimer halfway through the second course. He sat near the far end of the table, charming the lady beside him. Then his gaze swept the table and locked with hers. Every muscle in his body seemed to freeze. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale as snow. Imogen felt a savage satisfaction at the fear she saw in his eyes. "Lord Mortimer?" the lady beside him inquired. "Are you quite well?" "Perfectly well," Nigel managed, his voice strained. I thought I saw someone I knew." But he was not mistaken. Throughout the meal, Imogen felt his gaze returning to her again and again. After dinner, Imogen chose to wander into the conservatory. She was examining a particularly lovely orchid when a voice behind her made her blood run cold. "You should be dead." She turned slowly to find Nigel Mortimer standing in the doorway. He looked disheveled, his composure cracking. "Good evening, Lord Mortimer," she said steadily. "How are you alive?" he demanded, moving closer. "I watched you fall. The ravine is deep. You should be dead." "Evidently someone did come along," she replied, refusing to retreat. "Someone with the power to ensure my protection. The Marquess. Lockhart found you, and you married him. Why would he, unless you told him?" "I told him everything," Imogen confirmed. "Every detail of the widows you robbed, every orphan you left destitute." He was quite interested in that information, almost as interested as he was in your family's possible connection to his brother's death. "You cannot prove anything," Nigel hissed. "Can I not? I have a remarkable memory. And my husband has remarkable resources. How long do you think it will be before he matches my recollections to actual victims? No one will believe the word of a nobody against my family's reputation. They might believe the word of the Marchioness of Lockhart." She let her voice harden. "You tried to murder me, Lord Mortimer, but I survived, and now I am beyond your reach. You are finished. You think yourself safe?" Nigel grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in hard. "I can still destroy your family. Release her, now." Lord Winter's voice cut through the conservatory like ice. Nigel's head whipped around to find the Marquess standing in the doorway, his gray eyes blazing with fury. "My Lord Lockhart," Nigel stammered, dropping Imogen's wrist. "I was simply having a conversation with your wife." "You were threatening my wife." Lord Winters moved forward with predatory grace. "And you were touching her without permission. I believe you should leave before I forget we are in Lady Beatrice's home and deal with you as you deserve." "This is not finished," Nigel said, backing away. "On that, we agree," Lord Winters replied. "But the ending will not be what you imagine." Nigel fled. Imogen swayed forward, trembling, and Lord Winters caught her, his hands steadying her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "No, just frightened. How did you know where to find me?" I have been watching the Mortimers all evening. You handled that well, but you should not have faced him alone. I am not alone anymore, she said softly. I have you. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the cold facade. For a moment, she thought he might say something, but then his hands dropped away. We should return to the other guests. Let them see us together. On the third evening, during the ball, Lord Winters asked her to dance. Dance with me, he said. He led her onto the floor for a waltz. His hand settled at her waist, proper but firm. They are watching us, she murmured as they turned. Let them watch. Let them see that you are beyond their reach. Is that all this is? Performance for their benefit? His hand tightened fractionally. What else would it be? I do not know, but sometimes when we work together, I wonder if perhaps this arrangement has become more than purely practical for you, as it has for me. Lady Lockhart, Imogen, you must not confuse partnership with affection. I cannot be what you deserve. I can only offer protection and partnership. Why have you locked yourself away so completely? You do not understand, he said, his voice rough. When Edmund died, it nearly destroyed me. The only thing that saved me was deciding to dedicate myself to destroying those responsible. That cold fury has sustained me for a decade. If I allow it to soften, I fear I will lose the strength needed to finish what I started. The raw honesty of his confession struck her silent. The following morning brought unexpected developments. At breakfast, a housekeeper named Mrs. Margaret Holloway approached Lord Winters. When he returned to Imogen's side, he wore a look of grim satisfaction. Mrs. Holloway, the Mortimers' former housekeeper, overheard Nigel and his mother planning your murder the morning of the sleigh ride. She is willing to testify. She heard them planning it? Precisely. It transforms the act from a crime of passion to calculated, premeditated murder. Combined with your evidence, we have them. That afternoon, Lady Beatrice requested the Mortimers depart early, citing concerns about financial irregularities that had been brought to her attention by Lord Winters. 2 months later, the investigation reached its conclusion. The night before they were to submit their evidence to the King's Council, Imogen found Lord Winters in his study. Second thoughts? She asked. No. Simply reflecting on how long I have waited for this moment. Yet now that it is here, I feel empty. Perhaps you need a new purpose, she suggested. One focused on building something meaningful. Such as? The Lockhart Women's Refuge. I propose we use a portion of your fortune to establish a private patronage, a sanctuary where women victimized by men like Nigel can find safety and resources. You wish to establish a charity? I wish to do something meaningful. Is that not a better legacy than simply destroying the Mortimers? Lord Winters studied her face. You continue to surprise me. Very well. If you wish to establish this refuge, I will provide the funding. Thank you. Jasper, when this is over, perhaps consider that there might be room in your life for something beyond vengeance. Perhaps companionship? I do not know how to be what you deserve, he said finally. Then perhaps we could learn together? The trial of the Mortimer family was a sensation. The evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Holloway's testimony, Imogen's detailed reconstruction, and the surprise testimony of Briggs, the groom, who confirmed Nigel had dismissed him explicitly to be alone with Imogen on the morning of the accident. The moment that sealed their fate came when their own solicitor admitted to helping them falsify documents. Nigel Mortimer was sentenced to transportation to the penal colonies of New South Wales for the term of his natural life. His parents were convicted of fraud. Their assets were seized to provide restitution, and they were left destitute and socially ruined, forced to flee to the continent in disgrace. But perhaps the sweetest victory came from an unexpected quarter. Nigel's maiden aunt, the one whose fortune he had sought to secure, was so horrified by the revelations of the trial that she rewrote her will entirely. Instead of leaving her wealth to the Mortimer line, she bequeathed it to the newly established Lockhart Women's Refuge. The night after the verdict, Imogen found Jasper in his study. "It is finished," he said. "Edmund's death is avenged." "Then let me help you learn to live again," she said softly, covering his hand with hers. "We could have a real marriage, Jasper, not just a practical arrangement." "I can try," he whispered, interlacing their fingers. "God help me, Imogen. I can try." 3 months later, Imogen stood in the main hall of the Lockhart Women's Refuge. The property had once belonged to the Mortimers, seized as restitution. Jasper stood beside her. "You have done well," he said. "Edmund would have approved." One evening in late summer, nearly a year after their marriage, they walked through the gardens at Lockhart Manor. "A year ago I married you because it was practical," Jasper said, stopping to face her. "I told myself it was purely business. But now I find that I cannot imagine my life without you. I know that your happiness matters to me more than my own." He withdrew a ring, a delicate creation of sapphires and diamonds. "This was my mother's. I would like you to have it, not as part of a transaction, but as a symbol of what we have built." Imogen's eyes filled with tears as he slid the ring onto her finger. "I cannot promise to be perfect," he said. "But I can promise partnership, respect, and a gradual building of something real." She rose on her toes and kissed him. "It is enough." Years later, the Lockhart Women's Refuge would be remembered as a beacon of hope. But for Imogen and Jasper, the greatest victory was the life they built together. She had been left bleeding in the snow, abandoned by a man who saw her only as a loose end. But she had been found by a man who saw her as worth saving, and who eventually learned to offer her something far more valuable: his heart. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of courage, justice, and unexpected love moved your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, hope, and the power of second chances.